Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be returning to the popular online college forum. So, this is the applying to college thread in Reddit. So, we've done this before a couple of times in some past episodes, haven't done it in a while, but we're going to be going through basically combing this forum for some various questions that may overlap with some questions, hopefully, that audience members have. And so, we're going to basically be responding to these questions in the forum. Before we get into that, if you have any questions of your own, you can feel free to send them to us at info@greatmindsadvising.com. And we'll have the email address in the show notes and all of our social profiles as well if you want to shoot us a DM on Instagram, and we may pick your question for a future episode. All right, so let's get into it. We're going to be answering 4 questions from this thread on Reddit. So, first question, the title is Looking for Some Advice for Course Selection for Rising Junior. Hi, I'm looking for some suggestions regarding course selection for Rising Junior. His high school does not offer AP Biology until 11th grade. However, he has already completed Biology 101, a half credit at a community college, and self-studied for the AP Biology exam and earned a score of 5. Given this, is it necessary for him to take AP Bio in the 11th grade, or is it acceptable to skip it? Will it negatively impact his college application? He has also completed Anatomy and Physiology, 1 credit, and plan to do Health Careers, 1 credit as well. Health Careers class will involve shadowing opportunities and similar opportunities to get exposure to the medical field. Okay, so basically the question here is this student self-studied for the AP Biology exam without taking the actual class at their high school. They got a score of 5, which is, of course, notable and good. Um, and then they also completed Biology 101 at a community college. So they were wondering whether they need to actually take AP Bio in high school or whether that's not necessary. So the situation may arise for some people where the student may be thinking of self-studying for an AP exam and taking the exam. I would say that's generally not preferable. It's not optimal to only have taken the AP exam if, especially if your school offers, that actual class, right? Usually, ideal is going to be that you actually have a full class that has a grade that you can send to the college on top of submitting an AP score. So I wouldn't consider them exactly the same. Just skipping a course and not having a grade to submit to the colleges, and only sending an AP score, even if it is a grade score such as a 5. You really ideally want to have a class and an actual grade on top of the AP score, if you can. And there are some external options in terms of courses and some programs where you do actually get a grade if you're not taking it at your high school. So in this case, the student took it at a community college, but there are other programs, other online options where you do actually get a course grade, and then you can submit the AP score as well. So that usually is going to be ideal. Now, there are obviously always nuances and contextual variables, in terms of, the situation and the course, how relevant is it to the student's interest, their hook, is it a core class, not a core class, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always going to be different contextual factors. If the student really absolutely could not, take the course for some reason, and this was sort of the only way that, they could log this AP, then maybe you would just submit a score. There's a whole bunch of different scenarios for this type of situation. Okay, second question here. How to write a good application update letter. So this must be from a senior. So should I only be talking about things relative to my major? How many points maximum? How long should it be, etc.? Okay, so this is in reference to a updating a college during the ongoing application process after you submitted your application during senior year. So I do want to dissociate 2 different concepts here. One is a formal deferral letter, or what's often known as a letter of continued interest. So that is not the same thing as, just submitting updates to your application. Now, there are students who do try to write a letter of continued interest after, specifically they've been deferred. It could also be that they were waitlisted in the spring, and they do try to shove in that letter of continued interest. Since I applied, I got this award, and I founded this club, and they try to basically update their resume, and so they basically try to merge these two concepts of a letter of continued interest and basically an application update, right? And this would seem fairly logical, and a lot of advisors and companies and a lot of people will say to do this. It is actually not optimal unless the college, has some actual vehicle that they have you update them, and they specifically, are requesting updates, and then there's a question that's maybe more along the lines of a letter of continued interest. But if you're writing a standard letter of continued interest, it is not meant to be, sort of a resume add-on, right? And it can actually come across in a very negative way. You have to sort of fundamentally understand that anytime you are signaling accomplishments, that is obviously something that is just part of the admissions process. You're trying to signal your value as a potential student at the college. However, it's always a very delicate tightrope of, first off, just not being, potentially annoying or irksome or sending the college too many updates. But then, second to that, there's always a tightrope that you have to walk of not coming across as unlikable or potentially, like braggy. A letter of continued interest, a standard letter of continued interest, that really is much more of a creative piece that really reinforces the student's strong interest in the college. It is very difficult to write one that is highly compelling, right? That being said, this is not going to be the forum for talking about a letter of continued interest. Just understand that generally speaking, if you're writing a standard letter of continued interest, it is not really an invitation to, again, add on, a bunch of accomplishments in that letter, right? I would sort of dissociate the two concepts. Now, in terms of assuming the student's not talking about a letter of continued interest, but they're just talking about, "Hey, I got this extra award or this changed in my application since I applied. I wanna sort of update the college. What do I put it in?" Right? And it's not clear what they're referring to because they're saying how many points maximum, which means that they could be referring to a letter of continued interest. But I'll sort of just, walk through this as I was planning to, either way. So I sort of said, on a letter of continued interest, it's not meant to be sort of a resume add-on. Now, if you are separate from a letter of continued interest, if you are updating a college in terms of changes to your application, new awards that you've won or resume updates, those should be very sparing and at top and highly selective colleges. There are very few updates that are actually worthy of updating a college, right? And so one of them would be, in January when the Regeneron Awards come out. That's basically the most prominent science competition in the United States. If you are, a semifinalist, or if you're a top 40 or a finalist, that is worthy of potentially updating a college, right? If it's a major accolade, if it's ISEF, in the spring, those can actually be submitted to the college. However, a lot of what students think to submit is not actually worthy of submission. It needs to be something quite significant. And you should also understand what your original candidacy was, right? So if you got deferred and basically this is at pretty much exactly the same caliber of, several items that were in your resume that initially merited the deferral, this is probably not something that is really going to move the needle, right? So you should have somewhat of a sense of what was in your original file to sort of be able to compare this to see how much of a marginal improvement on your candidacy it actually is. Generally speaking, you want to use updates to the colleges quite sparingly, and anytime that you're adding more information to your file, there should be a good justifiable reason for it. There's always a risk anytime you add further communication with officers. You don't want to sort of come across as braggy or, potentially again irksome. So you just have to be careful, right? And I would not suggest that people send a bunch of updates to the colleges, and you just have to be careful in terms of making sure that these are not very, updates that just basically blend with the application that you originally submitted and just are not really worthwhile updates to your application. Okay, third question. So the title here is Private College Consultants. Wouldn't know anything about that. So, is it unusual for many private college counselors to give extremely generic cookie cutter advice to everyone, or to continuously push those overpriced, unselective summer programs from top 20 brand name schools as if they are receiving some sort of kickback? So, this one's pretty funny. I'm going to talk about quickly just the second one. I like kind of the wide array of questions in these forums. So, most of you should know by now our stance with respect to these summer programs, especially pre college programs, especially ones that have fancy brand names attached to them, fancy university names. Maybe you want to go to those universities, but you don't necessarily want to enroll for these summer programs, as we've discussed. I wouldn't even necessarily say that it's a matter of being unselective versus selective. There could be a program that is actually selective in terms of having a low admit rate. That still does not necessarily, it's better than being unselective, but the selectivity in terms of just the admit rate doesn't necessarily mean that it's a high value summer program. So we've talked about there being certain summer programs that are extremely well known and highly respected. You have Iowa Writers, you have RSI, you have MNTSI, you have Yale Young Global Scholars. There are certain programs that are very notable and very prestigious. They are selective, but they are also, have a very strong reputation and are very noteworthy in the eyes of admissions officers, right? But those are very few and far between, and not to be confused with many of the typical pre-college summer programs that often tend to be, more generic. They may be higher priced, sort of pay for play, so to speak. In terms of whether advisors sort of push some of these programs, obviously we don't. We've advocated quite strongly against many summer programs for various reasons. And we have an episode on that, The Truth About Summer Programs, and have mentioned this in multiple episodes. If an advisor is pushing an unselected, I won't even say unselective summer program, but one of these summer programs that are not as notable, there could be a multitude of reasons. One could be they're very new and they just don't actually understand that these are, not really standout activities for students applying to top colleges, right? So in the same way that a lot of people listening to this podcast, students, parents, they hear something on the podcast and they're like, "Oh, I would have never thought that. I wouldn't have known that. I would have thought that, this Columbia summer program is very prestigious because it has the Columbia name attached to it." It's the same for potentially an advisor, right? They might be early in their career and they just don't sort of have the knowledge and they're sort of just getting their bearings, right? So that could be one sort of situation. Second situation is the advisor may not work with students or families who are targeting the most selective colleges. And so some of these summer programs may actually be totally fine, right? If you're targeting a top 100, top 75, college, even just showing any modest degree of intellectual vitality and, going out of your way over the summer to, enroll in a program to sort of further dive into a field, that could be much more differentiating at less competitive schools, right? So that's another reason, right? Is the advisor potentially, maybe is not as niche down on working with students who apply to as selective of colleges. Third reason, and I think this is sort of an important point for people. Sometimes I will point out, and I think some people mistake some things that I say along these lines. I will point out a potential issue with something in terms of what people do or what they're considering doing. But that doesn't mean that's the final judgment or that I've issued the final verdict of you shouldn't do it. I am simply in some cases saying, listen, there is this liability, or you need to understand this thing for what it is. It doesn't mean to not do it, right? So recently we had a video short that we had on social media. And it was just basically a clip from one of our longer podcast episodes with me basically saying, DECA isn't gonna, get you into a top college, right? that is basically it was in a context, for students starting the process very late who are not going to get to, international level, at in DACA, right? And basically saying that that type of move, that's a very common cliche business activity. That type of move, especially very late in the game, is unlikely to create the type of outcome. That doesn't mean that you couldn't join DECA even very late in the game. It's just you don't want to confuse that with a type of move that has a high likelihood of return or getting you to the outcome that you need to get to, especially that late in the process. So there's sort of a distribution of tactics, and some of them may just be when you're building a resume, they may be a bit, on the lower value or, mid value. They're not super necessarily high value activities, but you have to look also at, what do you have to pay for them? And I don't even necessarily mean in terms of financial cost, that could be a factor, right? You may not want to pay for a pretty low value summer program if it costs $12,000. But that aside, usually the main cost is going to be your time, right? And so if you have a bit of a lower value, low mid value activity, but it's relevant to the student's hook, especially if the student's younger, right? So if they're a younger student, they're in seventh, eighth, ninth grade, some things could be a little bit more age appropriate, right? Just starting, to build your resume. A summer program may be fine as a first sort of, foray into a field. However, what happens is there are 11th graders or kids going into senior year who are still doing these unimpressive summer programs, and they basically have no time left, and the runway is basically about to run out. And that is not the type of move that is commensurate with what they need to accomplish their goal, right? And so, as usual, there's different contextual nuances, right? And it depends on the student's candidacy. How old are they? How relevant is the activity? And then the big one in terms of cost is also going to be time, right? How much time does this take? If this takes you a half an hour once a month, it may not even matter that it's low value. If it's low value and it's a sport and it costs you 20 hours a week, and that is costing you, doing other things, or your grades are going down, or you can't study enough for the SAT or the ACT, that may be a very material cost that you can't afford to pay, basically, right? So there's basically going to be sort of a spectrum here. If something's lower value, but maybe it's relevant to the student's hook, or there's, whatever it is, but it's a minimal time commitment, that could be okay, right? So there's a lot of nuances here, and, I would say if you do one of these, commonly marketed summer programs, but again, it's relevant to the student's interest, especially if they're younger, especially if it's not a major time commitment. Some of these factors can mean it's okay. And summer programs they can definitely still, even the ones that are not, the top 10, top 15, they can still play a role in a student's resume building, right? It's just not confusing them as being very high value vehicles. There are very few summer programs that are high value vehicles and true standout differentiating programs, right? And so I'm not necessarily saying don't do it in any potential context, across any grade or any situation, any time commitment, any financial cost. I'm saying that you don't want to confuse something that is low value as a high value move, because if you think it's a high value, again, you might be in a situation where that's sort of a move and that's one of your final moves, and then the clock basically runs out and you confused a low value maneuver for a high value maneuver, and now you don't have any time left, right? And so, or you're just, in the middle of the process, or wherever it is, right? And you're confusing the moves on the board, right? You think this is a significant move, it's actually not. And so you've misestimated the caliber of the student's profile and their candidacy and how differentiated their candidacy actually is, right? So it's more about just not confusing a lot of these programs as being, major high value, standout, highly differentiated activities. There are very few summer programs that fall into that bucket. But again, particularly Maybe it doesn't cost a lot of money. It's not a huge amount of time, or prevent other activities that are maybe a higher value. The student's younger. These would be several variables on one end of the spectrum that would make it more acceptable to potentially enroll in one of these less notable, less prestigious summer programs. Again, in terms of advisor, mentioning one of these programs, one could be they are truly just not aware or as seasoned. If they're very experienced and they're still recommending these to students who are targeting highly selective colleges, that is a major cause for concern. So one could just be, lack of being seasoned. Second could be more typically work with, students and families who maybe aren't targeting the most selective colleges, where this could be more differentiating, even just showing any again, modest degrees of intellectual vitality. And then there is actually a case, even for students who are targeting more selective colleges, where these programs could be at least like somewhat of an initial foray into their field. And as long as you don't confuse them with true high value differentiated activities, you're fine. As long as you pursue other activities that will help to differentiate your candidacy. Okay, I think this is our fourth and last question here. So the title is Low Stats plus Ivy? Question mark. Hi guys, I know I already applied and it's kind of over now, but I'm just wondering if anyone was able to get into an Ivy for the class of 2030 or 2029 with lower stats. I'm just losing hope because everyone I'm seeing in the I Got and Insta pages sounds super cracked. A great Gen Z term here. And like, obviously, Ivies want cracked people, but I don't want to throw my application into an empty bucket. I assure you the bucket with all the rejections isn't empty. It's where most applications go, unfortunately. Low key, any advice would help, but I'm mainly just looking for someone to give me some confidence before I spiral. LMAO. Thank you guys. Okay. So obviously written in the King's English, as with most Gen Zers. So, okay, yeah, in terms of this low stats, I think most people could probably predict my response here in terms of getting into an Ivy or highly selective college with very low stats. And by low stats, they basically mean lower metrics, meaning GPA, grades, course ranker number of APs, IB, whatever college equivalent class is offered, lower test scores, etc. Now, obviously, what that actually means, we don't really know. That's subject to interpretation. Are we talking about a 3.3 GPA? Or are we talking about low as being a 3.88? Right? So low is obviously subject to being further defined and specified. A lot of people they ask very, vague questions, right? Or poorly defined questions. So in terms of having lower stats, we've talked about this on prior episodes. In some cases, lower stats can just get your application weeded out in the earlier rounds of review. That can obviously just happen. If you're looking at lower stats, if you're looking at, for example, a 25th percentile, test score for admitted students at a certain college or whatever it is. There's a reason why the schools use what's referred to as an interquartile range, right? So that's from what they'll typically report is the 25th to the 75th percentile. The reason they do that, the reason why most people will say you don't want to aim for the 25th percentile is because that bottom 25% of students, the students who will have sort of the quote unquote low stats, usually are well, they're not usually, they are anomalies. Those are the bottom-most students who actually got accepted, and so they are anomalously low, and that means there's something else that's anomalous about their candidacy, right? There's something else, as I've sort of said, the scarcity in your profile, essentially admissions is just all about supply and demand, right? And so the scarcity in your file has to add up to something, basically, right? Or the points basically have to add up to something, some total to get accepted. If you have a very low point total from your metrics, there has to be something else that's exceptional about you, right? Because this is exceptional, but in a very bad way. You're an exception, but in the negative direction in terms of this aspect of your candidacy. Now, the issue is that this is also the foundation of your application, right? Your grades, your course rigor, your test scores. this serves as basically your core academic index. And so it's not necessarily the same as some other factors as well. This sort of serves as in many cases, the first shot, a preliminary review of a student, right? So, yes, there are students who are athletes who sort of, again, different buckets potentially. There are students who have other special advantages, donors, they're underrepresented minorities. There are just students, again, geographically, and whatever it is, there could be other special factors, but there also usually are thresholds, right? In terms of this, I think some people think that they can just make up their low stats with extracurriculars, and that logic usually almost always is not going to actually work, right? So I think a lot of people who sort of find themselves in this position, it's sort of a bit of a wishful thinking exercise to sort of say, well, I have lower stats, they sort of want reassurance that it's going to be okay. And again, it depends on how low, what low actually means. We have to actually define this. But in the vast majority of cases, again, there's a reason why the general wisdom is to not consider yourself super viable if you are in the 25th percentile of a metric or lower at the college. And again, that's because those students are on the extreme low end. And so there is something else that must be exceptional or extreme or anomalous about their candidacy. Now, if there is something else that is, exceptional, like we just have to look at those nuances and the candidacy on a case by case basis. But collapsing across all those contexts and nuances, the common sense answer pretty much prevails here, which is having low stats, of course, is going to make your life a lot more difficult in terms of gaining admission to a highly selective college. The other issue as well is when you have some aspect of your candidacy that is a major potential constraint, especially the foundation of your candidacy, it makes other downstream decision making very difficult, which means, for doing ED, as we've talked about, and that's sort of being a high leverage decision or, applying under some other early plan that blocks out other schools, single choice early action, restrictive early action, etc. You have to make a very high stakes decision. And so you don't want to be in a position where you feel like you're really going to potentially waste that early shot because there's something fundamentally wrong with your candidacy, especially the core academic index. And when students just have something, it could be anything in their candidacy that is significantly lower, meaning there's more variance. I call these higher variance candidacies. This would be a student who maybe has, they have a top 10 resume, but they have a, top 30 academic index. The more spread you sort of have, or the more variance in the candidacy, it can just get more unpredictable. The outcomes creates harder decision making and just not sort of the type of position you want to find yourself in. Okay, that is it for this episode. Going through 4 different questions here from the online applying to college thread here on Reddit. We will have a part 2 version of this in the coming weeks. And hopefully this was helpful to everyone, and we'll talk soon in the next episode. Bye bye.